Bonjour tout le monde. What can I say to introduce Fire Emblem Heroes, the wildly successful mobile gacha spin-off of a long-running Nintendo franchise about making anime chess pieces kiss? I actually resisted playing Heroes for years myself, because I saw in it only an extension of Awakening's absurd fan service-laden DLC maps and scenarios. Now, that's exactly what the game is, but in my pretentious elitism, I couldn't have possibly foreseen that Heroes would in time develop a complicated meta all its own, or provide thought-provoking additions to the characters in its roster, or offer fan service that's more to my taste, or generate near-monthly fandom wank. Keeping the rumors alive, child brides, I married my adopted son, Fire Emblem, you endless font of tastelessness, never change. I did eventually cave and give Heroes a try this past winter, and it's alright. There's too many resources and facets to unit building to ever reasonably keep track of, and fortunately for my bank account I'm immune to predatory gacha practices, but it's alright. What most motivates me to keep playing is the goal of filling out the in-game catalog of heroes, sort of like a Pokédex if your magical cockfighting collection were made of people instead. Don't think about that one too hard. What's more, even though the catalog is closing in on 700 different heroes as of summer 2021, there are still hundreds more potential new additions to be mined from the rosters of the mainline Fire Emblem games. And with my love of making lists and what some might call an excessive knowledge of this franchise as a whole, I thought it'd be a fun exercise to go through all the characters who haven't gotten into Heroes yet, and share with everyone which ones I think are likely to show up on a banner at some point. The fandom likes to tie itself in knots arguing over which games or settings are the most or least represented, and so here I'll be setting the record straight with some hard numbers, along with a lot of only somewhat informed speculation on future editions, because what's the point of talking about a gacha game if you're not going to roll the dice and risk being proven wrong about what it does next? Some ground rules before we get started. I'm only talking about playable characters today. I'm well aware that a fair number of Heroes units are not playable in their original games, and while I briefly considered pouring through the Choose Your Legends results to see which NPCs Intelligent Systems is willing to entertain as viable additions, I assure you that there's plenty to talk about without me going through all that. Besides, this video isn't really about Choose Your Legends. You could probably count on one hand the number of characters I talk about today who have a chance of cracking the top 10, much less any higher, short of whatever kind of botting shenanigans led us to getting Brave Gatekeeper next month. I won't be accused of encouraging anything like that. I'm also only covering the mainline Fire Emblem games. In other words, the ones fans have given numbers to. No Warriors or Tokyo Mirage sessions here, more because I'm largely unfamiliar with those titles than simply me being a purist snob. Characters with multiple versions in the mainline games will not be counted more than once, because at that point they'd just be alts in Heroes. The most well-known example of this would be Anna, who's been playable in 3 mainline FE games even though her Fates and 3 Houses incarnations have yet to make appearances in Heroes. I won't be including any units like that, with one exception I'll explain later. Oh, and by the way, you're going to be hearing my own pronunciations for a lot of these characters going forward, since many of them don't have their names voiced in canon. I'm trying my best here, but even with the help of online guides, I'm probably going to struggle with some of them, especially for the Jugdral games and their abundance of Irish names. No one has any right to complain about French phonetics being unintuitive when Irish exists. Alright then. Let's start from the beginning, at Fire Emblem's oldest and most nostalgia-laden setting, in Japan at least. The 4 Archanean games, Shadow Dragon, Mystery of the Emblem, and their DS remakes, are relatively untapped for Heroes units, with a total of 44 characters not yet represented. Of course, a large part of this is that the design philosophy of Mart's games doesn't work terribly well with the needs of a mobile gacha, or the sensibilities of modern Fire Emblem for that matter. These titles are much more built around the expectation that the player will approach them as what are now called Iron Man runs, where you don't reset when your units die, and thus need new units to replace them. These games' rosters are flooded with forgettable filler units, who'll do the job in a pinch but will never leave much of an impression as characters because they barely have personalities and in some cases are practically clones of one another. We'll talk some more about those in a bit, but I did want to highlight some Archanean units who I do think have a pretty good shot at a Heroes banner. Most obvious is Mart's sister Ellis, who's actually already in Heroes as part of a duo unit with her brother. It wouldn't be much of a stretch at all to see her as a hero in her own right. Then there's Nina, who barely satisfies the playable requirement of this list. She's more like a plot-significant NPC who's playable on a technicality, but even so, she is a big deal in the plot and a predecessor to later characters like Guinevere. Maybe she'll show up alongside a pre-corruption version of Hardin and some kind of Camus alt. Awkward. There's a handful of characters who I think have a chance of making it in based on their associations with someone already in Heroes, like Wendell and Arlen for Merrick, Gota for Tiki and Zane, Medea for Astrum, Samson for Sheena, and Cecil as the third of a trio with Luke and Roderick. Some of those also have notable gameplay performances that make them more memorable, like Wendell, the ridiculously OP early game pre-promote, or Gota, the original endgame powerhouse unit. Frey may get in based on his memorable role in the prologue of the Shadow Dragon remake, where he's canonically the character to sacrifice himself so that Marth can escape the army invading Altea. He's presumed dead, but then comes back in New Mystery because everyone's in that game. Samuel is a little of a stretch, but his whole gimmick of pretending to be a famous swordsman, in this case Navarre, will go on to be used for other similarly ridiculous characters I'll talk about later. I wouldn't be surprised if at least one of those guys got into Heroes. Finally, I've included Dice and Malice in this category. This father and daughter duo isn't super memorable, and their only playable mainline appearance is in New Mystery, but their designs are more creative than most in Archanea, and Malice likely has a bit of what I'll call the waifu factor going for her. It's pretty well accepted that straight men are Heroes' primary demographic when it comes to sexual fan service, and that thus female units tend to show up with more frequency and often with better quality as well. As such, I'm more hesitant to write off women from getting into Heroes on that basis alone. Undoubtedly, there are some guys who think Malice is hot, although personally I'd rather go for her dad, provided he loses the dumb Viking helmet. Next, there are the Archanean characters I consider less likely to make it into Heroes, even if they may have one or two notable traits that keep them from being totally forgettable. There's Mama's boy Castor, mimetic loser and terrible unit Mathis, Julian's possibly bi-curious booty call Ricard, love-struck armor knight Roger, Jake, who's the boyfriend of his game's Anna, awkward, plot-relevant Bishop Boa, Jagan replacement Aaron, mostly loyal general Lorenz, not him, Gordon's near-identical little brother Ryan, romantic cleric Marisha, precocious royal siblings Jubilo and Yulia, and a trio of moderately quirky paralogue additions in the Shadow Dragon remake. Etzel is totally a clone of Blazing Blades Canis, if you were wondering. They're all fairly obscure, but they've got nothing on the rest of the unrepresented Archanean roster. These guys tend to come in sets, which really doesn't help their case. Bord and Cord are actually notable because they're part of a trio with Barst, who did make it into Heroes. Does anyone really care, though? You've got Hardin's Wolfguard, 2 random mercenaries, 2 only slightly less random armor knights and their archer friend, this early game hunter, 3 remake-only cavaliers loyal to Camus, and a late-game remake bishop no one remembers. Unless one of these guys becomes a meme out of nowhere, I feel confident in saying we're highly unlikely to see any of them in Heroes. Switching gears now for a bit of a modern interlude, courtesy of IS's inconsistent remake pattern. Fire Emblem Gaiden and Echo's Shadows of Valentia don't give me much to talk about here though, both because their rosters are on the smaller end and because most of them are already in Heroes. Undoubtedly this is a consequence of FE15 being the first mainline title to release after Heroes, making its characters' inclusion in the mobile game a form of timely marketing. There are only 7 characters from Echoes who haven't yet appeared, and judging by the fact that the most recent Valentian banner was only about half Valentian, I wouldn't wager that we'll be getting most of those remaining anytime soon. The one exception to this also happens to be the exception to my rule about duplicate characters, because IS loves the White Wings enough to give them multiple alts, including Valentian versions. Est is the only one who doesn't currently have one, so it's only a matter of time until she does. The other 6 are all men, and not terribly interesting ones at that. Mycen might be the most likely pick for his plot relevance, unless they opt for Jesse the incorrigible flirt, or Dean because he's the counterpart to Sonya. Kamui, Atlas, and Noma? Yeah, I'm not seeing it. I'd be remiss though if I didn't mention that there are technically 4 other characters in Echoes who are not in Heroes, namely the 4 DLC characters who serve as cameos for the Cypher trading card game. But as they don't appear in the Choose Your Legends polls, I'm going to guess that IS isn't interested in promoting its now-ended trading card property in Heroes. It's kind of a shame. Emma, Randall, Yuzu, and Shade could easily make up a banner all on their own. Moving on to the Jugdral games, Genealogy of the Holy War and Thracia 776, aka Game of Thrones if it was an anime and also everyone didn't hate the ending, is, depending on how you measure it, even less represented in Heroes than Archanea. All in all, there are 73 characters in these two games that haven't been added yet, but the distribution is pretty skewed in parts. Let me break it down and show you what I mean. For those who may not know, FE4 is broken into two separate generations, each with a completely different roster apart from this poor overworked man. The first generation is actually quite well represented in Heroes already, with only 8 of its characters not yet included. The easiest pick for Heroes at this point is Aiden, the only female first-gen character remaining. I could see her added alongside a regular version of her twin sister Bridget, who currently only has a pirate seasonal. I'm not really sure what IS would do with regular Bridget, considering she is a pirate in canon, but that's their problem. The 7 missing men are all various levels of forgettable, with only Claude having plot relevance. But he also shares his name with one of the leads of the most recent game, so good luck getting in with that. Nisha, Alec, Midir, Dew, Holland, and Beowulf may or may not be solid units and potentially good fathers for some of their game's eugenics babies, but I feel like they'd all need a remake to make them stand out. Hint, hint. Huh. Genealogy sure has a lot of blondes in its roster, doesn't it? We're not done with them either, because the second generation has a fair number of blonde characters too, in addition to being less represented overall, with 28 missing from Heroes. But let's cut that number in half, because 14 of those are what are called substitute characters, who you'll recruit in place of the child characters if their mothers were either killed or not paired at the end of the first generation. To date, there have been no substitutes in Heroes, despite there being several child characters who have these as counterparts, and given their relative lack of distinguishing features or plot relevance compared to the kids, it wouldn't surprise me if they were left out entirely. Unless a remake came along and made them proper characters independent of the children. Again, hint hint. As to the rest of the second generation though, waifu factor compels me to highlight Aiden's daughter Lana, Erina's daughter and fellow Pegasus Knight Fee, Bridget's daughter Patty, and Tailtooth's daughter and Ishtar's cousin Teen. Personal preference compels me to highlight Diarmid, the only member of House Nordion missing from Heroes who's also gay or at least indifferent to women thanks to a mechanical oversight. It's complicated, but the long and short of it is that when Diarmid's mother, uncle, sister, and cousin are all in Heroes, it's only fitting that he should be too. Others who are notable by association include Larce's brother Scatha, Oife, who co-parented Seliph with Shannon, Tailtooth's son Arthur, not him, Bridget's son Fabale, and Sylvia's son Corpel. That just leaves Aiden's son Lester, Corpel's adoptive father Hannibal, and brothers Yuchar and Yucharva who exist to fight each other to the death for the right to perv on Larce. Those would be the least likely picks out of the second gen, although still above the substitutes. FE5, though, fares a lot worse than its predecessor, and with only 14 of its roster of 52 appearing in Heroes currently, it might be the least represented game in the franchise at this point. Part of that is the obscurity of Thracia 776, even relative to the other Japan-only titles, but another part is that it has the same problem as the Archanean games, where the cast is bloated with filler units. To be fair, that's more justified in FE5 thanks to the fatigue mechanic forcing you to field more of your units than usual, but it's still not great for characterization. Some of the more likely candidates for Heroes representation include Diarmid, again, because he's playable here too, Fergus, one of the best units in the game and probably Diarmid's half-brother via a philandering father, an assortment of female characters including Dancer Lara, Pegasus Knight Corinne, Falcon Knight and daughter of Dithorba Misha, Cleric sisters Safi and Tina, Bow Knight Selfina, and plot-significant Lenone. Then there's Halvin, friend and counterpart to Ocean, Tanya's father Dagdar, and his beloved Marty, who also has meme power. Hey, it worked for Kemph and Ronan. Philandering drunk Homer, the series' first playable dark mage Salem, whose hair is ridiculous even by Jugdral standards, bandit leader Pern and his harem of enemy dancers, yes, really, Selfina's husband and possibly Finn's childhood friend with benefits Glade, Shannon impersonator Shanam, and Merita's deadbeat dad Galsus. However, a good half or so of Thracia's roster is just not notable enough to wind up in Heroes. Again, it can happen. I certainly would have never picked Ronan to appear in the game, but there's a lot of repetition and one-note personalities, and even some forgettable female characters that don't have a chance of standing out, unless we get a remake, maybe. Until then, they can only hope for the power of memes to save them from the unflattering distinction of coming from the only game in the series whose breakout star in Heroes is a non-playable boss. Now, the Elibean games present something of a conundrum for this video. They're interconnected enough to where I do sort of have to talk about them together, but even so, there's not a ton of overlap between characters. Put together, Binding Blade and Blazing Blade have 40 potential additions to Heroes, so as has been the case with the other big lists, let's get the more likely picks out of the way first. To start with, all the remaining women, which is notable in this case because the Elibean games were the first in the series to include playable female characters who aren't what you call conventionally attractive, at least in the game's art style. These include Saul's put-upon bodyguard Dorothy, scarred Wyvern Lord Veda, and the series' only visibly elderly female playable character Nime, who's also Canis' mother and a master of dark magic. They're joined by Guinevere's servant Ellen, Eat the Rich thief Kath, and Paladin Isadora, who forms a tragic couple with Harkon that Heroes could use if another Elibean bridal banner comes around one year. Moving on to other men, Marcus serves as the Jagan character in both games, and I'd like to think that because they only have a paired ending with each other and no one else, Marcus and the merchant Merlinus become the catty old queens keeping Roy's army together in FE6. I mean, come on, they've got to include that in Heroes. The trio of Kent, Sane, and Will could make it in as part of the group Will refers to as Lindis's Legion, based on Lynn's enduring popularity and excessive number of alts. Moreover, there's the odd thought that none of the GBA Christmas Knights are in Heroes yet, and I'm fairly sure that Kent and Sane are the most well-known duo of that group. There's Elphin, Percival's beloved prince who's masquerading as a bard. Related to them too is Douglas, adoptive father of Elphin's mechanical counterpart Larum, as well as the third of Etruria's generals in FE6 alongside Cecilia and Percival. There's a few others that are a bit of a stretch, but I could maybe see it, like Rebecca's amnesiac brother Dart for another pirate banner, or, speaking of pirate banners, Geese's older brother Geitz. Sin as Sue's bodyguard and as a second nomad to somewhat balance out the Ilian Pegasus Knight trio, and Gonzalez, who seems built to be a meme between his hideous appearance, high power, low accuracy gameplay performance, and status as one of the series' few playable bandits. Finally, there's Athos, who's pretty much Dumbledore, which used to be more topically relevant since FE7 came out during the height of the Harry Potter craze. He's not secretly gay, probably, but he and the game's main villain Nurgle have a long history together. Heroes could easily do something with both characters. Then there's all these guys, and yeah, pretty much the same deal as Archanea and Thracia here. Binding Blade especially is just about as bad as those older games when it comes to forgettable filler, and even the ones with something to distinguish them, or the handful here from the prequel, kind of get lost in the shuffle. Some potential standouts here include Astolfo for his history with Igraine, Hugh for having a recruitment even more dependent on money than Farina's, whichever of Lowen or Wallace would make for a better meme character, and possibly Renault if they ever add Nurgle, simply because his backstory goes to some utterly strange places. Fascinating as that may be, however, I feel like I'm starting to grasp at straws, so let's look into the third GBA game, Sacred Stones. I consider FE8 to be pretty firmly average in many respects, and that's also reflected in its heroes representation, with 17 of its 43 playable characters not yet in the mobile game, so a bit under half. There are some easy picks for the next Magvel banner, like Pegasus Knights Vanessa and Cyrene, or Crybaby Archanea, and for the men, Artur and Renak, who are the often exasperated traveling companions of Lute and La Rochelle respectively. 3 Cavaliers, 3 beefy older men, and Naomi's boyfriend Combe round out the roster from the main story, all of whom I consider more long shots than those previously mentioned. In addition, there's also FE8's Creature campaign, the post-game dungeon crawling mode that allows you to recruit 10 more characters who are either NPCs or bosses in the main story. 5 of those are already in Heroes, and of the 5 who aren't, I'm not really seeing much potential. Possibly Joshua's mother Ismare, or Erica and Ephraim's father Phaedo, who'd be an easy choice for a Valentine's banner, since Heroes likes to make those about lords and their fathers for some reason. Rev, Glenn, and Hayden, on the other hand, not too likely. Next up is Tellius, a duology that arguably qualifies as a cult classic among the internationally released games for its devoted fanbase coupled with its notoriously poor sales and currently very pricey barrier to entry for new fans. This is somewhat evident in its Heroes representation as well, with 41 characters not yet present across both games, which is nearly as bad as Archanea. There are other factors too, though. The rosters of Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn overlap almost perfectly, making it impossible to consider the game separately, and the lack of real supports in Radiant Dawn leads to around a third of that game's cast being filled with, again, two-dimensional units with barely any personality. Regardless, there's still a fair number of solid options for future Tellius banners. First of all, because Heroes introduces most new units in groups of 4 or 5, let's talk cast groups. Edward, Leonardo, and Nolan form the core Dawn Brigade alongside Micaiah and Soth, and if you toss early-game healer Laura in with them, they could make up a new banner all on their own. Alincia's trio of retainers Bastion, Lucia, and Joffrey could make up a banner too, with either her uncle Renning, hot-headed Red Knight and Joffrey fanboy Kieran, or taciturn assassin on Bastion's payroll Volk making up the fourth. Except, wait, both of those ideas are unlikely because they each only include one woman, which I'm pretty sure Heroes never does. Damn waifu factor. Speaking of that though, it's only a matter of time, I think, before Pegasus Knight Marcia along with Astrid and Khalil make it into Heroes. The chance of Marcia's gambling layabout brother Makalov getting a spot is, I'd say, rather smaller, but perhaps they could pivot a banner around the siblings and Astrid's comically bad taste in men, since she and Makalov can end up married. Heather the lesbian thief will presumably also appear at some point, because obviously. There's also Tellius' second catgirl Lyre, and on top of the predictable fan service incentive here, it must be noted that this setting has a slight advantage over the rest when it comes to new heroes, thanks to the Lagus representing the majority of potential new beast units. For that reason alone, I'd consider it likely that Tibarn's eyes and ears Janaf and Ulki, along with Kanigas' nephew Skirmir and Nayla's retainer Volug, making appearances in Heroes somewhere down the line. There are Lagus in the roster who come with less development or fan attention and are therefore still likely to be overlooked for a good while, however. These include Kanigas' undeveloped Shadow Gifka, Nasala's elderly retainer Nealucci, and the trio of characters known in Radiant Dawn as the Lagus Emancipation Army, who suffer from infamously awful availability in that game, and very little development outside what Tormod and Muarim get in their first game. Oh, and there's also the Dragon Prince Kurthnaga and his father's 2 retainers, but they would of course be dragon units in Heroes, so on the basis of variety they would contribute less than the beasts or birds. Last, a few moderately likely stragglers, like Prince Pelias of Dayan, or Boyd, who has the unfortunate designation of being the only one of the 11 core Grail mercenaries to not currently be in Heroes in some form. That's pretty rough. There's an assortment of others, as you'd expect, but these units are all plagued by limited personality and screen time and just, frankly, have never gotten all that popular. That kind of thing's not just limited to the Japan-only titles, you know. Skipping past the DS remakes, we come now to quote-unquote modern Fire Emblem, starting with Awakening. And, at this point these lists are really winding down, because each game from FE13 forward is proportionally very well represented in Heroes. The mobile game leaned heavily on Awakening and Fates content for its first 2 years or so, and it's been very generous with banners for Echoes and Three Houses as well since those games released. As much as the fandom likes to complain about oversaturation, this is understandable from a marketing perspective. You want to promote your current sellers, right? As such, though, I don't have many characters to talk about for each of these games. Awakening has just 10 of them who aren't in Heroes yet, and while it's been a good while since there have been any new additions from this title, it seems like a safe option for filler banners when nothing else is going on. We still need Vake, Muriel, Kellum, Rickon, and Gregor from the first generation, as well as Muriel's son Laurent, who is the only one of the second generation not yet represented. Then there's avatar sexuals Basilio and Flavia, who would almost certainly come as a duo or even a duo unit, and the two remaining endgame spot pass recruits Yenfei and Priam. I consider those last two the least likely new additions from Awakening, when neither of them are particularly notable or popular apart from Priam reigniting the endless discourse over whether or not Ike is gay. Please don't put him in Heroes and add more fuel to that fire, for the love of God. On the subject of filler banners, I get the impression that that's more or less the best way to describe the most recent banner, featuring a newly introduced Heroes original and a trio of Fates characters who were natural choices based on waifu factor alone. Taking them into account, FE14 is now missing just 17 of its cast of nearly 70 in mobile form, and as with Awakening, the majority of the usual suspects have now been exhausted. Mozu stands out as the only non-avatar sexual first-generation female character who still needs to be added, along with Hayato as the only male. But he's basically a Hoshiden-flavored Riken, so no real surprise there. 6 of the game's 9 avatar sexuals are still missing, as are 9 of its 22 child units, but given the scarcity of reasonable picks and the fact that we've just had a Fates banner, I wouldn't bank on any more additions for quite some time yet. When it does happen, I predict IS will return to the second generation before they add in any more of the avatar sexuals, with particular emphasis on Sophie, Mitama, and Caldore for obvious reasons. You can't say IS doesn't know their primary whale demographic, or that their choices aren't eye-rollingly apparent to everyone outside that demographic, myself included. At least Mitama would be a fun addition. Just think of all the haikus the writers would have to come up with. Now, technically speaking, Fates does have one more source of new characters to pull from, those being the bosses recruitable through the game's capture mechanic. However, I barely count these units as real members of the playable roster, when they have nothing separating them from generic captures apart from names and unique portraits. They're only a step above Shadow Dragon's generic replacement units as far as I'm concerned, and none of them have gotten popular or been turned into memes enough to where I could see them being added to Heroes. Sorry, theoretical fans of the Bara Bandits. Last, and just about least, we arrive at Three Houses. As any number of Heroes players will tell you, the game is currently suffering from a severe case of Fodlan exhaustion, not just in terms of an overrepresented roster, but also in a meta defined to an unhealthy degree by units like Fallen Edelgard. It's not a pretty picture, although if you were to look at the list of missing Three Houses units, you'd be forgiven for thinking the nightmare was almost over. A mere 10 units remain to be added into Heroes. Ignatz is the one regular student unfortunate enough to have been completely overlooked by Heroes even 2 years after the release of Three Houses. A friend of mine even suggested that I title this video The Lament of Ignatz, but as I'm pretty indifferent to the guy myself, I opted instead to plug my more obscure faves on the thumbnail. Everyone plays favorites, you know. The remaining 9 missing units come in 2 flavors, non-student characters and the Ashen Wolves. I could see either group forming a banner all on its own, with one of Hanneman, Manuela, Gilbert, Alois, or Cyril coming in as a bonus 5th unit in the Tempest Trial or something. Or Hanneman and Manuela could make for a hilarious duo unit, that way getting all of them onto the actual banner. The Wolves, meanwhile, feel tailor-made to be a Heroes banner, with it only being a matter of time before IS acknowledges that Three Houses had DLC. That's kind of the thing, though, when talking about FE16 and Heroes. It was the first non-remake made after the release of the mobile game, and you could definitely say it shows based on the way it groups together its characters, and, even more noticeably, that all of its student characters come pre-made with 2 versions even before any special Heroes alts. If this mainline game content drought continues on much longer, I could absolutely see IS releasing Three Houses banners with post-timeskip student heroes, instead of reserving those for the house leaders and Choose Your Legends winners. The fanbase would rightfully call this out as a lazy cash grab, but we'd still pull for them anyway. It's not like I'm any better either. I'd love a post-timeskip Dedue to be cherished by my many Dimitris, or a post-timeskip duo Hubert and Ferdinand whose lines are all nods to Wicked and other appropriate musicals. Come on, IS, they even have their own duo epithet already, the Empire's Two Jewels. Someone has to be the next MM duo after Ephion, after all. But that'll about do it for me and my wishful thinking. Thank you all for listening to me ramble my way through the Fire Emblem series a second time. Leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video and are interested in more of my content. Now, what about you guys? What characters from past games are you still waiting on in Heroes? How likely are they to get in your opinion? Do you think we'll ever get a more ridiculous addition than Gatekeeper? Let me know in the comments below. Au revoir!